Welcome back to The Takeout. Sources tell CBS News Luigi Mangione could plead guilty tomorrow to a set of federal charges stemming from the 2024 murder of UnitedHealthcare CEO Brian Thompson. Mangione is due in court tomorrow. Plea talks have been going on for weeks. Now, we won't know if a deal's been reached until Mangione agrees to it in court. Let's turn to CBS News legal contributor Caroline Polisi, who's been tracking this for us throughout. So we won't know anything until it actually happens. I know there's lots of conversation about this, Caroline, so we don't want to speculate about which we do not know, but there would be implications, double jeopardy and death penalty if a deal is reached, correct?
Absolutely. There are obviously not only implications for how his federal case is resolved, but obviously the state case. Now, on the federal side, what a deal could potentially look like is him pleading guilty to those stalking charges. Now, as you mentioned, that death penalty has been taken off the table and it's not an option anymore. Remember back several months ago, the federal judge dismissed the charges that carried with it the possibility of the death penalty. So that's not an option. But if he pleads guilty to those two stalking charges, the most he could get is life in prison without the possibility of parole. But there's, a possibility that he gets a number of years that's lesser than life. And so what he could be aiming for in this plea agreement is perhaps the government arguing for some type of lesser sentence. You never get a guaranteed sentence when you enter into a federal plea deal, but he could be looking for a letter perhaps from the prosecutors to the sentencing judge to say, look, we don't necessarily think this merits a life in prison sentence. Or he could do an open plea wherein he would argue to the judge himself why he believes, that he shouldn't get life in prison. But you're right, it does have the state implications as well.
So walk us through the state implications, because the state has interests in this matter as well and doesn't want to be boxed
Up,
out.
up, Absolutely. And so the state, since the very beginning of this case, Major, the defense attorneys for Luigi Mangione have been saying that this is a real miscarriage of justice, not the least of which is because of this double jeopardy issue. They had raised it earlier in the state court case, saying it's not constitutional for him to be prosecuted for the same crime in these two separate jurisdictions. At the time, the judge said that was a premature argument to be making because there was no conviction in the federal case. Now, a plea deal obviously changes that. And so everybody is speculating that this could essentially revive that double jeopardy argument in the state case. And what that is, it's not only a constitutional argument, but really in New York State, there's more robust protections for defendants around the double jeopardy laws. And so that could be a real issue here, at least one that would merit litigation, if not dismissal.
Caroline, the reasons for Luigi Mangione and his attorneys to negotiate this are obvious, death penalty and otherwise, even though that's off the table. Long prison sentence, life, and all that sort of stuff. What incentives, if any, if that's the proper word, exist for the prosecution on the federal side?
Yeah, exactly. A bargain is just that both sides should receive some sort of benefit. Even though the evidence in this case is very strong, what we've talked about from the beginning of this case is that public fascination with Luigi Mangione. And, in some circles, he's become a bit of a folk hero. So, the federal prosecutors are thinking of this case. It's never a slam dunk when you have those 12 jurors. You just never know what could happen. And in this case in particular, you have a raised possibility of what we call juror nullification, wherein a jury gets seated and there's someone in there that just, regardless of hearing any of the evidence, is never going to vote to convict Luigi Mangione. And that's a real issue here. So the government gets a quick guilty plea on the books without that potential of going to trial and having things up in the air. So that's the benefit to the prosecutors. And then obviously the benefit to Mangione is perhaps a shot potentially at not being in prison for the rest of his natural life.
Caroline, isn't that idea of possible jury nullification on such a shocking ambush type of crime in itself kind of shocking?
Oh, it's absolutely shocking, but I've never actually seen a case where there might be a strong argument for prosecutors to consider it, given what we've seen around the case, given that he has so many supporters. It's a real contention. Now, look, the voir dire process and jury selection process is obviously meant to root out those types of people. But there have been cases where some jurors sneak through the jury
Right?
picking process, and they just will do what they want to do.
Caroline Polisi, great stuff. Thank you very, very much. Appreciate it.